First of all, thank you so much to Daniel and Natan and to the rabbi for welcoming me so warmly this evening. And thank you for coming and not going to the debate, watching the debate. So I'm going to talk this evening about a book that I worked on for actually almost my entire life. The day that I sent out the manuscript a year and a half ago, my daughter, who's 26 years old, posted a photo of herself at the age of 4, and she said, "My mom finally finished it." And so in the spirit of that photo that she posted on Facebook, and I will come back to Facebook also later on in the talk, I'd actually like to do something a little bit chutzpahdik for an academic talk, and I'm going to show you some family photos. This is my great-grandmother. And if you look at this carefully, you can see, if you look at her hairline, you can see that she's wearing a shilah. That's the wig that observant married Jewish women wore and still wear today. And the photo's taken around, I'm guessing around 1910. She's incredibly old-fashioned in the photo. Look at how she's dressed with this high collar, this brocade dress. And this photo, which was taken about the same time, was my grandmother, her daughter, and I like to think of her as very she. She's got a bow in her hair, she's got bows on her shoes, and she's about as sharp a contrast as you can imagine to her mother at that time. This photo was taken in a park in Newark, New Jersey, in the early 1950s on a warm spring day, and the woman with her back to us is my mother. She has a white blouse on and a black pencil skirt, and if you look very carefully over her shoulder, you can see a baby's bonnet peeking out. That's me. And I didn't bring a photo of me because I'm wearing what I always wear, which is a black jacket. That's the only kind of jacket that I own. And this one is of my daughter, and she's taking a selfie, and technology is going to be important in the conversation. She's wearing a short skirt, and so she looks very much like a college student, and she's wearing tall boots. And when she said I could use the photo in the talk, she said, "Mom, you know, those boots are yours." Of course, I totally didn't remember that. So the thing is that, like, what am I doing with these photos? So I'm thinking, as I look at the photos, I think about the world and the lives that the women in my family photos made. My great-grandmother was one of 2.5 million East European Jews who came to America between 1880 and 1924. And that immigrant experience shaped her life. My grandmother was actually born in the United States, but she was born into an immigrant milieu, and she raised her children during the Great Depression. And that shaped her life and her career opportunities. She worked, actually, the bow in her hair was significant. She worked in millinery at one time, and then she also worked as a clerk. My mother came of age at the end of World War II. She had her children during the baby boom, and she did what other American women, especially American Jewish women, were doing then. She stopped working during the baby boom, and then later on, after the children were grown, she went back to work. Her background had been as a secretary. Eventually, she became a real estate agent. She worked until the age of 85. I rode the coattails of a revolution that led me into academia. I mean, if you think about the changes, right? I heard that, wow. I didn't make a revolution, but it pulled me into my future. And it is also that same revolution that opened the doors for women like me. It's also the revolution that opened the doors that lets my daughter be a medical student today. What the future will bring for her, I don't know. But one of the things that struck me as I looked at these women, so the clothing was different. Their life experiences were different. And yet there was something also that bound them. They were all Jewish women. And I was really curious, obviously I'm going to extrapolate out from my own family, I was really curious about how being Jewish had shaped their lives. So if you think, now I know enough about the Jewish experience to understand that there are millions of different varieties of what it means to be a Jew. But the way I categorize it is I think of, there are some Jewish women for whom Judaism sits at the core of their lives. They move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday. They live within the circle of their neighbors who are Jewish. They live within a Jewish world. They join Jewish women's organizations. That Judaism is their raison d'etre. But there were other Jewish women for whom Jewishness was important, and I define Jewishness as the everyday experience of being a Jew. Jewishness was important, but it wasn't at the center of their lives. So Jewishness would determine things like who they married, the neighborhood they could live in, because there were neighborhoods they couldn't live in, the kinds of work they did or the kinds of work they couldn't do. So it was part and parcel of their lives and very important, but not as central as for the others. And then there's a whole category of Jewish women for whom being a Jew was something that it just wasn't very important to them. But every once in a while they would discover that it was very important to other people, that they would bump up against their Jewish identities. So I wanted, in this book, I wanted to capture all of these women. I wanted to capture the women who were deeply embedded in their Jewishness, and I wanted to write about those who were not so embedded in their Jewishness, and I wanted to write also about sort of women living on what I see as two canvases. They're the women, I'll never call them ordinary, but the women who left their marks on their families, their neighborhoods, what I see is the smaller canvas. They left their imprint on that. And then I wanted to write about the women who left their imprint on the larger canvas of American history, American Jewish history, even world history. Because both of these groups are really important to understanding this story. Because what else binds them and what else bound the women in my own family is that there are these commonalities that run across women's lives. The women that we're going to meet, we're going to read about weddings, we're going to read about babies born, we learn about the meals that they cooked, places that they lived, organizations that they established. We see them embedded in a world, and that world changed depending on where they lived. So we meet them in colonial seaports, in frontier towns, in urban ghettos, in post-war suburbs. We're going to meet feisty matrons, we meet business women, we meet the women who became rabbis, and we see these women living in so many different times and places. We also learn about how their lives changed. I want to know about the homes they made, how they raised their families, the kinds of work that they did, the politics that guided them, the games that they played. I always wondered, like, when did Mahjong become a Jewish woman's game? And also, to get back to my point about that cell phone, about technology, because this photo captures for me how technology changed women's lives. You have any idea what she's doing? Well, laundry, right? She's doing laundry. Right. She's not cooking the clothes. This is quite likely a posed photo from the mid-19 teens, because she probably wouldn't have been holding the baby and wearing these kind of nicer shoes that she seems to be wearing. But imagine what it was like to do laundry before an electric washing machine. Electric washing machines are not invented until the 20th century. I'm interested in this because I hate to do laundry. It's something I can't stand to. But imagine that she has to, so she's lucky because she can fill the tub at the sink. She doesn't have to haul the water. But she's got to boil it on the stove. She's got to stir it. She's got to take the clothing out. She's got to wring it out. She's got to haul it up to the roof, hang it out to dry, hope it doesn't pour like outside today, and then she's got to bring it down and iron it. I mean, this was an enormous effort that it took to do laundry. Technology changed women's lives. So Finally, in terms of this introduction, I'm really interested back in this concept of, what it means to be a Jew. So I'll just show you this real fast. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. And that's the women that I'm going to write about, that I'm going to talk about. So we're going to start with this woman, Grace Nathan. Grace Mendes Seixas Nathan was born in Colonial, New York. Her father had left Portugal in the days when no Jew could live openly as a Jew in Portugal. And he left in his early teens with his parents, and his parents remarried as Jews in a synagogue because they had to have been Catholic when they were living in Portugal. And then eventually her father made his way to America, where, by the way, they had what is the original mixed marriage. He was Sephardic from Spain. He married an Ashkenazic woman, a woman from Germany, from the German country, and he scandalized the New York Jewish community when he did that, because the Sephardic Jews thought they were higher, but his wife was richer. And so Grace Nathan, if you look at her dates, so she's born, she lives through the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the War of 1812, before that the Constitution. But what does she write about in her letters? And by the way, she also left us poetry. What she tells us in her letters are things like, she's writing to a niece and she says, I'm really worried about one of our other relatives. She's been spitting up blood for days, but the doctors are convinced it's because of her tight corsets. So again, about how clothing changed and how it impacted women's lives. Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter was this woman. Anybody recognize her? Emma, I heard it, Emma Lazarus. So Emma Lazarus had a completely different life. She never married, she never bore a child, and she left her imprint in this nation's history. In fact, if you saw what Ken Cuccinelli said about a week and a half ago, he rewrote her famous poem, Give Me Your Tired, Your Poor, Your Huddled Masses Yearning to Breathe Free. He rewrote it to say that he only wanted your tired and poor could stand on their own 2 feet. But what is so great about these two women is that they lived their lives as Americans, as women, and as Jews. And all three intersect to shape the way that they were thinking. So as women, they were confined by the roles that women could play in that time and place. As Americans, they imbued a spirit of liberty that they then applied to their understanding of themselves as Jews. So let me give you an example. Emma Lazarus wrote in a different poem, she wrote that she celebrated America, the land that gave her people the freedom to follow Moses' law. And then she said, and to, quote, think the thoughts Spinoza taught. So if you know anything about Spinoza, you know that Spinoza was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated from the Jewish community because of his heretical ideas. Emma Lazarus, in claiming Spinoza alongside Moses' law, is shaping her vision of what it means to be a Jew. The stunning thing is that Grace Nathan does something also very similar. Towards the end of her life, she wrote an ethical will. I don't know if you know what that tradition is. I see a couple of nods. So an ethical will is a document that someone crafts towards the end of their life to leave to their families with the lessons that they want to impart to them. And in her ethical will, she said to her only child, her son, she said to him, at my death, keep your beard for 7 days. Only for 7 days. If you know Jewish tradition, you know that it's customary for a man not to shave for a minimum of 30 days after the death of a parent. Grace Nathan was taking American liberty and using it to change Judaism, and that's going to become a major theme of what I have to talk about, how Jewish women impacted Judaism. So half a century before Grace Nathan was born, only 35 years after the first Jewish community came to America, Abigail Levy Franks came to America, and she married, at the age, she was 16, she married Jacob. He was 24 when they got married. And then they had, I think it was a total of 9 children. And Abigail Levy Franks also evidenced this kind of freedom, this kind of radical thinking for a colonial Jewish woman. So let me give you an example. First of all, the reason we know about her is that she left us a treasure trove of letters. Her letters, she wrote letters to her son, her eldest. He had sailed to England to be with his uncle, his father's brother, and to work in the family business, which was of doing trade around the Atlantic world. And in one of her letters to Naphtali, her son, she said, "I don't want you ever to eat anything except for bread and butter at your uncle's house." And that's because she didn't trust the kashrut of her sister-in-law's kitchen. Obviously, Naphtali did not listen because Naphtali married his cousin, his uncle's daughter. So that likely didn't happen. But then, in another letter to him, she gets really aggravated with the New York Jewish community. She's actually an incredible gossip. And she writes that I am sick of these, quote, idle ceremonies of the Jewish people, and if a Calvin or a Luther, the great Protestant reformers, would rise amongst us, I would be the first of their followers. It's a stunning kind of statement. She's yearning for reforms in Judaism well before the 17th century, well before we have reforming of Judaism starting in the 19th century. Abigail also learned the price of that impulse, because when her daughter Phila intermarried, Abigail wrote that she was so depressed that she never wanted to see or speak to anybody again. And we don't know, actually, if she ever reconciled with Phila, because we have a letter from Jacob where he writes to Naphtali and he says, "I'm trying to get your mother to talk to Phila again." And one of the things that happens in Abigail's family is we don't think that any of their grandchildren, any of the Franks' grandchildren, remain Jews. So the big issue of intermarriage in the Jewish community is actually something that comes up in the colonial period. Now I'm going to jump to the 19th century, to this woman, Rosa Sonnenschein. Rosa Sonnenschein came to America as part of this large wave of Jews coming from Central Europe in the middle decades of the 19th century. She was married to a rabbi, and they came and they settled in St. Louis. And in St. Louis, Rosa Sonnenschein did what rabbis' wives are supposed to do. So she helps out in the synagogue, she has the 4th of their 4 children, she bears that child in America, and she does something that I love. She founded in 1879 the first Jewish women's book club in America, and it's still meeting today, which is just astonishing. They actually preserve their minutes. I got to go through the minutes, and they followed some kind of procedural rules, which I really love. They decided that they would fine anybody who came to the meeting late. They would fine them 10 cents, but they voted down doing away with coffee at the coffee break. But Rosa Sonnenschein, while she's doing this, she's also actually beginning to write some articles in the 19th century Jewish newspapers. And then in the 1890s, she walks out on her husband. The marriage had been unhappy for a very long time. She accused him of all sorts of things. He accused her of all sorts of things. But when she walked out on him, she gave him grounds to divorce her. Because I don't know if you know this, but until, actually like in New York, until 1964, you needed grounds to get divorced. You couldn't just get divorced. So by giving him grounds to divorce her, she couldn't collect any alimony. By the way, she told her grandson, She said, he said, why did you do that? And she said, I wanted to get rid of him. I didn't want to ruin him so that he could still practice as a rabbi. So she's stuck. She's got to earn a living, and she founds the first English language Jewish women's magazine in America and calls it the American Jewess. And first I want to say something about the name. We don't tend to use the word Jewess today. We actually know that the word Jewess really declines after the 1940s. It has all sorts of connotations, but in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, Jewish women called themselves Jewesses, and they were called by others Jewess, and it was not seen in a negative way. And in this magazine, she writes, because, I mean, you can imagine who's reading it, it's middle-class housewives, so she writes about things like wives and mothers. I mean, she was really praising the kind of middle-class world that one would expect, but she's also, like Grace Nathan, and like Abigail Levy-Franks, she's pushing the boundaries. So for example, in one of the issues, they feature a woman named Ray Frank, who was known as the girl rabbi of the Golden West. In another issue, she writes, this is actually really quite daring, she writes about Zionism. She's an early Zionist. She met Theodore Herzl. In 1897, she went to the first Zionist Congress, and by the way, at this point, American Jews are not Zionists. Most of them don't even know about it. She goes to the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and appoints herself the only representative of the American press at the Congress, because nobody else sent a journalist, so she comes back and writes about that. And she's calling for things like, she wants women to be able to vote in their synagogues. Because she says, I studied the rosters of 100 different synagogues, and the name on every single roster is Mr. So-and-so. And she says widows, even widows don't have their names on the rosters, and their punishment is taxation without representation. They've got to pay for their seats, but they can't be members. And some synagogues begin to heed her call. She also begins to focus on a moment when the great powerhouse Jewish women's organizations emerge. In 1893, Hannah Solomon founded the National Council of Jewish Women. It still exists today. In 1912, Henrietta Zold founded Hadassah. It still exists today. In 1913, Carrie Simon founded what is now called the Women of Reform Judaism. A few years later, Matilda Schechter founded the Women's League of Conservative Judaism, and a few years after that, the Orthodox Union Women's Branch was founded, and they all exist today. And I was struck by what's going on. Like, why are women able to found these major nationwide Jewish women's organizations when they hadn't done it before? What is it about the late 19th century and the early 20th century? And if you look at some structural changes in American women's lives, I think that's where the answer lies. In 1800, the average white American woman had 7 children. In 1900, she had 3.5. I don't know what to do with the half. I can't figure that out. But in 1850, the life expectancy of the average white American woman was 40 years. By 1920, it was 57 years. I think it's simple math, right? Living longer, fewer children, more years in which they're looking to do something to fill their lives. And these are middle-class women. They were not going to go into the workforce. There's no feminist movement that they were going to be joining. And so they create these powerhouse organizations. This is an example of the National Council of Jewish Women at the White House in 1926, because the organizations took up major political platforms. Their platform, fighting white slavery. White slavery and international prostitution rings was a scourge of the late 19th and early 20th century. It still exists today, and this was something that these women took up. Hadassah did something different. Hadassah decided to take up health care in the Jewish community in Palestine. This is a photo of two nurses, American nurses, that the women of Hadassah sent to Jerusalem. They hung out a sign that says in Hebrew and English, American Daughters of Zion, Nurses Settlement Hadassah. They saw 5,000 patients in their first year. And then they had to shut down during World War I, but then of course they went back. I'm really interested in this theme of Jewish women's activism. Jewish women didn't always need powerhouse organizations to be activists. In 1902, in New York City, when the price of kosher meat soared from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound, housewives, immigrant housewives, who needed every single penny to make ends meet and to be able to feed and clothe their families, went out and launched a kosher meat boycott. They broke into butcher shops, they took the meat out, they threw it on the street, they doused it with kerosene, and sometimes they even set it aflame. And when one of them was arrested, and these kosher meat riots, they spread to Philadelphia and Boston. I don't know about Minneapolis, but I know about other cities. One of them who was arrested turned to the judge and said, "We're not rioting, only see how thin our children are." He really understood what was at stake. This is the first of decades of food and rent strikes that Jewish women were involved in. But sometimes Jewish women stood up, not as part of a crowd, but as individuals. Edna Ferber, a Pulitzer Prize winner, she wrote Showboat, she wrote Giant. Edna Ferber describes an evening where, after she's a famous author, she's in a soiree, somewhere where everybody was taken away and was secluded. They were all spending the night there. And she says that it's probably the late 20s, the early 30s. The host started talking about money-grubbing Jews. And everyone at the table began agreeing. And she stood up and said, "I am a Jew." And she said that she had never seen such hatred on the faces of people sitting so close to her. So standing up against anti-Semitism, a theme that is deeply concerning us today, has a long history among America's Jewish women. Here's one more example of that. This is a magazine that was published briefly in the 1940s. So this is an issue from 1942, and if you know anything about the timing of 1942, it's at the end of 1942 that America learns of the final solution of the plans to murder all the Jews of Europe. I Am a Jewess, written by Anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, but in this article, this woman describes the impact of anti-Semitism on her family. She says her son wanted to be a chemist, but he knew that even if he got into a college that would let him be a chemist, he would never find a job because that was an industry that didn't hire Jews. Her daughter wanted to go on vacation at a hotel with a friend, and instead she received a letter from the hotel keeper saying, "You're not going to find the people you want to be with here." And so, the hotels excluded Jews back then. And she writes in more detail in the story and then ends it by saying, "It can happen here too." So while Jewish women were standing up for social justice in these various causes, they were also continuing to change Judaism. One of my favorite writers, Kate Simon, I don't know if anybody's familiar with her. She wrote a series of memoirs. She was a travel writer. In her book, Bronx Primitive, she describes Shabbat in her house. Kate Simon and her mother had come from Europe, and every Friday, her mother would do two things. She would polish the furniture with lemon oil, and she would make gefilte fish. And then, as the Sabbath descended, she would begin to bless the candles. She'd cover her head, and she would say the blessings. And one Shabbat, Simon writes, her mother, in the middle of the prayer, tears off the head covering, blows out the candles, and announces, "No more. I don't have to do it to please anyone here, and my mother's not here, and I'm not going to do it anymore." And Kate Simon says, that her mother never lit candles again, but the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish on the eve of Sabbath. And so you see this transformation of Jewish tradition and the way in which it's retained. When I get to after World War II, this era of activism, and it just kind of begins to rush by. So I've got some headlines for you. Bronx Girl 21 wins Miss America title. Bess Meyerson, okay. Boxing fan wins $64,000 decision. Anybody know? What? No. Dr. Joyce Brothers. So here's a great example. Joyce Brothers Joyce Brothers is very unusual. She gets a PhD, becomes a psychologist in the late 40s, early 1950s, and she's married to a physician. He's a resident. They can't make it on a resident's salary. They don't pay them very well. But she doesn't want to go out to work because it's the 1950s and she wants to be home with her child. So her husband says to her, you know, you're really smart, memorize a boxing encyclopedia, which she does, and go on the TV show, $64,000 Question. And she won, not $64,000, but $128,000 because she won twice. He said it'll be so unusual, a woman who knows something about boxing, who knows about Bonnie Ross, for example. So this is part of the 1950s. Another headline from the 1950s, Case of the Teenage Doll. Barbie, but Barbie was invented by Ruth Handler. Ruth Handler, by the way, had 2 children, Barbara and Ken, no surprise. And now this one's not a headline, but this is Carole King and Jerry Goffin on their wedding day. They wrote a song called Will You Love Me Tomorrow, which was a big hit in the late 1950s, the early 1960s. What you should know is that she's pregnant on their wedding day. What happened to women who got pregnant in the 1950s? They had 3 choices: have an illegal abortion, have the baby and give the baby up for adoption, or get married. And that's also actually, it shows a kind of shift in the patterns of childbearing and child rearing. And then my last example from these years, Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique from 1963. So all these women are Jews. They're all very, very different. But their names in the headlines prove something. They prove that this image of what we think of the 1950s and the early 1960s is not so correct. So this is a great photo because it's these women pushing, I like to think of it as pushing the baby boomers into the future. I also like to think that women pushing baby carriages had an awful lot of time to think. Because together those generations helped to shape the feminist movement. But I think it's really important to understand the diversity of America's Jewish women in these years. And I've got 3 examples. Luba Bott. Luba Bott survived the Lemberg ghetto. She was sent to Auschwitz not as a Jew, but after she had been whipped by, until the blood ran down her body, after she'd been caught by Nazis and whipped, she insisted that she was a Polish Catholic, and so they sent her as a Polish prisoner to Auschwitz. She survived Auschwitz, and then after the war, she had a chance meeting with her uncle in Europe. Her uncle was Sidney Hillman, who was the head of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America and a major labor leader. And he brought her to New York, and she comes to New York, and she had been a nurse in Warsaw, and she cannot practice nursing. She can only be a nurse's aide, an aide in the hospital. Miraculously, her certificate of graduation from that nursing school in Warsaw survived. She got a copy of it after the war, and she mastered English, and she learned enough to pass the nursing license exam and to become a nurse in America. But when she gets to America, her aunt says to her, it's like she's here like a week, and she turns to her and she says, I want you to tell me everything that happened now, and then I don't want you to ever speak of it again. Because these were the years when the Holocaust survivors were silenced. Their stories were silenced. And so she describes what happened to her. And she wrote a memoir. It's not published, but she wrote a 2-volume memoir describing what happened to her. So she's my example of the tens of thousands of women who were either Holocaust-era survivors or even before that, German Jewish refugees. Another kind of dissonant image from the 1950s, the Rosenbergs. The execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg broke the back of the leftist politics of the American Jewish community in the 1950s. And I don't have to go into more detail about that, but Ethel Rosenberg was not the only Jewish woman who was a communist. Another example of dissonance from the 1950s, LGBT rabble-rouser Jerry Thayer. Jerry Thayer was, after World War II, left her husband and her kids and went to hang out in the lesbian clubs of Greenwich Village. And this is a particularly poignant photo because of what you can see in the background. Yeah. So we turn to the 60s. Life changes. Remember technology? Back to my point about technology. I don't know if any of you remember these, but I do. I remember growing up and my mother bringing them in the house, frozen TV dinners. Yes, technology was changing women's lives, but honestly, the bigger piece of technology that changed women's lives in the 1960s was the pill. For the first time ever, women in America and around the world had access to the most effective form of birth control. They could control their reproductive lives. Once they could control their reproductive lives effectively, they could begin to dream other dreams. The 1960s was an era of tremendous change. Some of these photos give you a sense of that. Here's the kind of change that was underway for American women. And Jewish women are stunningly in the forefront of the feminist movement. Not just Betty Friedan, but it's so, and I see a couple of nods, it's so many Jewish women that it's impossible to name all of them. The interesting thing about the feminist movement of the 1960s is that it was being advanced on so many different planes and levels. So for example, there was one woman who was a lawyer, a Jewish woman was a lawyer. She was a German Jewish refugee, came to America in the 1930s, and she was working at the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which was established to make certain that that the Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibited, I hope I have the right number, prohibited discrimination in employment based on not only race but also sex would be enforced. And she said all these complaints were coming to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and they were from women complaining about sexual discrimination. And the men in the office never thought that that part of the act was going to be enforced. So they were only investigating complaints based on race. And her name was Sonia Pressman, she helped found the National Organization of Women in order to advocate for American women's civil rights. And when it was founded, 12% of its founding members were Jewish women at a time when Jews made up about 3% of the population of the United States. Another Jewish woman, Gerda Lerner, was a refugee to America from Vienna. She became a historian, a women's historian. She lobbied her adopted country to create a Women's History Week. Today we have Women's History Month. And the feminist movement spilled over to American Judaism. So this is what synagogues used to look like, right? Familiar photos. Anybody recognize anybody in there? You see, yeah, somebody said it, RBG, right? Yeah. So she's sitting to the left of the rabbi. This is her confirmation. And she, I mean, obviously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, somebody who benefits tremendously and also creates part of the revolution that enabled change because she tackled the laws that discriminated against women. And then the synagogues also changed tremendously. So here's what a Shabbat morning service at the Union for Reform Judaism looks like today. I won't go into all the changes. I'm sure those of you that this synagogue has made major changes and other synagogues have made major changes. So in the short time that we've had together, we've covered like this incredible sweep of American history. We've looked at colonial era housewives, we've looked at immigrant Russian Jewish families, and those are the ones whose legacies colored in those smaller canvases I talked about before. But we've also looked at women who had such powerful commitments to social justice, either in their women's organizations or as brave individuals, and who left their marks in American history. So I want to close with another pair of letter writers. Do you remember when the Soviet Union refused to let Jews go? American Jews did something called twinning for their children at their B'nai Mitzvahs. Maybe some of you could have or twinned, okay? So in 1982, a 9th grader from North Miami Beach who liked to collect stationery wrote her Soviet twin asking had her letters and stationery that she sent as a Hanukkah gift ever arrived. So I found the Soviet twin, Kira Volvolsky, in Jerusalem. Of course, I found her on Facebook. Where else would I go to find her? And she's a web designer today, and she doesn't remember if they ever arrived. So, of course, the idea that you need paper today to connect is so weird. So I said to Kira, I said, well, are you and your American twin, are you Facebook friends? And she said no. She and Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, are not Facebook friends, but that Sandberg's mother and Kira's father are. And I think it's a great place to end because it's a new batch of letters and it's a new batch of writing, and that will be the next chapter in the history of America's Jewish women for somebody else to write. So thank you. I'm guessing we have time for questions. I don't remember what the time. Yeah, okay.
15 minutes.
All right, perfect. So, you know what I'll do? I'll walk around with this so that everybody can hear, and I won't have to repeat them. Linda.
You were talking about structural changes.
Speak into it.
You were talking about structural changes in this American Jewess, but I can't think of any American Jewesses who were active in the abolition movement. Am I?
Okay. So the question is about American Jewesses being active in the abolition movement. The best known of the early, the best known woman who was somewhat active in abolitionism, but much more active in the women's suffrage movement in the 19th century, and they were linked very much, was Ernestine Potowski Rose. Ernestine Potowski Rose came from Poland. She sued her father. Her mother had died, and her mother left her money and her father tried to use that money as a dowry, and so she says, and this is her story, she says that she sued him in Polish court and she won, and then she gave him the money, but she eventually leaves Poland, stops in Germany, stops in England, learns English, marries a utopian socialist in England, and then comes to America. And she's involved in a number of reform movements in the 19th century, but by and large, the 19th century abolition movement was very much a Protestant Christian movement. So she's in favor of abolitionism, but she's better known for her activism around women's suffrage. Yeah, Gary.
Pam, you mentioned early in the talk how scandalized the Sephardic Jews in New York were. Was it Frank?
Yeah.
Frank's family?
No, Nathan.
Nathan, yeah, sorry. married, one from the Portuguese family married a Ashkenazic woman from German-speaking background. Well, we know that the Jewish settlement in the U.S. comes in waves, and the waves tend over time to have different geographic focus in terms of the origins. And in the U.S., when they arrive in the U.S., there's a process of amalgamation that eventually takes place, but it's not easy and it's not overnight. So the old our crowd of German-speaking Jews in New York look askance at the East Europeans, and this goes on over time. Have you found in your work any difference in terms of gender in the process, that process of amalgamation? Do the women show any different patterns in the willingness to receive and include the newest wave than do the men, or is it about the same? And I have no idea, I just kind of thought this up.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So if I think about the East European immigrants coming in, and in 1880 you have about 250,000 Jews in the United States, and then over the next 40 years or so you get 2.5 million East European Jewish immigrants coming in. Both Jewish men and Jewish women are seeking solutions to the problem of this influx. And what I would see as a difference is in the approach. Jewish men found major organizations, they have much more financial resources. Jewish women do something quite interesting. They organize sisterhoods of personal service. And I really mean personal service. They went into the homes of the immigrant poor. They went in, as they said, to do battle with the 3 Ds, dirt, disease, and I forget what the third one is. They're rendering direct personal service. Their model is actually Christian women who are doing these kinds of missionary activities. And I don't find Jewish men doing that, but they're both responding to the same problem. Yeah, and they start the Jew, but the settlement movement, first of all, is a Christian movement first, and then, but there are some of these sisterhoods of personal service create their own settlement houses. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. So, you can take this where you will, but just the existence of a prevalence, if there was, of a non-socialist center of the road Democratic women's, was that the NCJW? I don't really know, but it seems like you talked a lot about women's worker movements, and then it jumped into feminism or something, and causes, and
Right.
just
So I didn't.
feel
Right. So I didn't. Right. What I think you're asking about is sort of women who have leftist politics and in the East European immigrant period, and I kind of like skipped over that because I couldn't do everything. But is that where you wanted to talk about, like,
yeah,
women
not
involved?
socialist.
Yeah, but women involved in the labor movement. Yeah, which is a major focus. So the East European immigrants are working class, and it's pretty much like a one-generation phenomenon. They come into the working class, they're working in the factories, and we know about the 1909 shirtwaist makers strike that the women led, and there's a moment in American history when Jewish women are very active in leftist politics in that immigrant world, and then some of them continue in leftist politics, like the Rosenbergs, for example, and others. I talk about somebody named Peggy Dennis, who was a major communist leader all the way up until the 1970s. So leftist politics is a very important stream. I kind of, for the purposes of this talk, I didn't go into it as much. Did that help?
Well, I was wondering about, like, center of the road Democrats.
Oh, you mean center of the road Democrats? Yeah, I didn't. No, I don't talk about like so much about like politics like that. Like, in trying to think of. Okay, yeah. Here's an example. One of Eleanor Roosevelt's closest friends was Eleanor Morgenthau. So Henry Morgenthau was in the FDR's administration, Secretary of the Treasury, and Eleanor Roosevelt. So here's an interesting example of how somebody kind of changes. Eleanor Roosevelt really grew up with the genteel anti-Semitism of her era. And then she befriended Eleanor Morgenthau, and there's a point where Eleanor Roosevelt actually resigns from some club that they belong to because that club won't allow Jews like her friend Eleanor Morgenthau in. So when you're talking about like center-of-the-road Democrats, I'm thinking of these women more as the kinds of organizations that they were involved with. They're not so much involved with democratic politics until we get to somebody like Bella Abzug. Yeah. Yeah.
When you first opened, you said you have women who lived their lives from holiday to holiday, and the ones that were medium interested in the others. And in the early 20th or in the 20th century, I wondered about the women who were Zionists, who weren't necessarily religiously oriented, but were very Jewish in their Zionist persuasion.
Right. Yeah. What's so interesting about American women in Zionism is, so we tend to think just of Hadassah, but actually there were other women's Zionist organizations. One was on the left, politically on the left, Kolei Zion, and the other one was Mizrahi women, which were Orthodox. And so you have Jewish women embracing Zionism, but it intersects with what their other identity is at that particular moment in time. Yeah. Others? Yeah.
I understand that Wyatt Earp's third or maybe fourth wife was Jewish, and someone saw a book called Prairie Dogs Aren't Kosher, and you mentioned a Bureau rabbi of the Golden West. How involved were Jewish women in the settling of the West?
Do you want to answer? So Linda's written about that. Do you want to say something? You don't want to? So, all right. The short answer is a lot. In the 19th century, the Central European Jews who come to America in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, they scattered across the South and the Midwest and the West. And they start out as young men peddling with packs on their backs. Eventually they get better off, and so they might get a horse and a cart, and then eventually maybe a wagon. And then when it's time to have a store, they've got to get married. So they go back east to find a bride, often on the Jewish holidays. They would go to New York, or from here they probably would have gone to Chicago. Or sometimes they would go all the way back to Europe. They would visit their parents, and then they would come back with a bride. My favorite story is the one of Fanny Brooks. Fanny was 16 years old. Her cousin Julius comes back to wherever the town was in Germany, and he's telling them all these wonderful stories about America, and she says, I want to go to America with you. And he says, well, you can only do that if you marry me, because your parents aren't going to let you come to America unless we're married. So they get married, they cross the ocean, and then she's the first Jewish woman to cross the plains in a covered wagon. And she settles in a number of different places in the Midwest and the West. And Jewish women were instrumental in creating Jewish communities in those towns. So they play a very powerful role in settling America.
Maybe one more question, and then there's a reception next door, and you're invited to continue the conversation there.
I think everybody's hungry. Let's eat.
Thank you.